Hello everybody and welcome to DC Fine Art. Today we're going to be creating this Pelican in watercolor and gouache mixture. I am using this Fredrix watercolor canvas board. It's 11 by 14 for my canvas. Now here is the back side of the board. Of course it says Fredrix and it has all the stuff listed on it too, just talking about the canvas board itself. So this is what I'm going to be using to do our Pelican. I'm going to remove the plastic and the board or little cardboard that's on there and then place out my drawing so that way I can transfer my Pelican onto the canvas board. The Pelican for the reference photo I got from Pixabay and it is listed in the description below. First, I'm going to start out with just placing some water on my canvas. I know I've seen a little bit of a yellowish green. I guess I had used this brush earlier and I didn't wash it all the way out completely, but it's not going to hurt anything. So basically all I'm doing is using plain water and just going around my transferred drawing on there so that way it's still shows, but also the watercolor kind of stays within those wetter areas so it doesn't transfer onto my Pelican. So after I get done with that, I'm using two of my watercolors from Daniel Smith. One is going to be the Undersea green and the other one is more of like a, I would say more of like a blackish, kind of grayish kind of tone, depending on how much water you add in it. And that's what I'm going to be using just for the background here. So here I am adding enough water. I'm basically using just the Undersea green, kind of going in here and making little streaks and little squiggles going all the way up. Just making sure I'm getting good coverage on my board and going in the direction that I want the background to go in, like the little green leaves and grasses kind of go up. So that's in the same direction I'm trying to use my brush strokes. At least trying to get everything covered as much as I can. I'm adding in some of the green, a little bit more of a thicker kind of green, not adding as much water to kind of darken it as I go. Now I'm using some of this other watercolor. It's the kind of like a blackish, kind of grayish tone. I cannot pronounce the name of it for the life of me, but I will end up putting that in the description below so that way you guys can see those names. So here I am just going over it, just kind of darkening some of these areas using the upward motion just so that way I'm getting some long kind of grasses that look like, you know, streaks that go in the same direction. So once I get done with that, I'm going to go ahead and wet my brush with just plain water, and I'm just going to kind of splotch and drop droplets of water randomly on my picture, as you can see. So here I am just randomly putting in some drops of water. Now, as I let that sit, it kind of blooms out. Now I'm going to take some more of that same watercolor by Daniel Smith, the darker one, and I'm just going to put little dots in the center of those little water droplets. Now, I was really hoping that it had enough water to be able to kind of blossom out a little bit, but with the canvas board, it kind of soaked it, so I had to take it and just kind of add some more to the center of those little circles. And then I came back through with a wet brush and kind of dabbed in the center of them so that way I can kind of get them to blossom out just a little bit. I don't want them to blossom out too much, but just enough to make a nice little center. Kind of going in there, just making sure I kind of swivel those around. Adding a little bit more of the darker little twigs and leaves, or like the little sticks that kind of come up. I'm just adding some more of those to it, like from the base, so that way it kind of comes up to it. So there I am, just adding these little bitty like marks going up to those little, I guess I just call them dandelions. That's what I'm going to make them into. So just making their little stems kind of go up, and then some of them just go up randomly and don't even have a little blossom on the end of it. That's perfectly fine. Just making sure I got my little centers in there. Some of those little sticks, and I'm just using that darkish gray blackish tone that I got with the watercolor. So I haven't switched over to my gouache yet. So now we're going to be working on the dandelions. I got a little bit of my white gouache and I'm using that. I'm adding a little bit of water to it, and what I'm going to do is just basically make like little straight line marks coming out of it, just like here and there, and then little dots going around. So little marks like straight lines coming out, and then I'll be going in and adding my little dots here and there. Now sometimes after I go through it and it looks like, you know, I moved on to the next one and you think, okay, am I done with that one? I'm probably not done with that one. I'm going to end up going back over these a few times until I'm happy with the way it looks. But that's all I'm basically doing is little straight lines poking out and then creating like little dots all the way around it and then some inside too. Now I know that my hand's in the way on this one, but I will show you guys the very last one. It'll definitely be where you guys can see it a little bit better. But just so that way you can kind of see what I'm doing, adding those little straight lines and then adding some dots around it, trying to make a little round little dandelion here. And I'm using my gouache on this because with using the gouache makes it more opaque, and that's why I'm using this. So here I am just creating them around some of those little areas that I had the little dots, and you can kind of see how it blossoms out. Now in some of these little dandelions here that kind of puff up, if the dark, like I'll go back in and some of these and add a little bit of black from my gouache. So I'll use the gouache on it too, but I'll add a little bit of the black to the center if I'm wanting to create a little bit more depth in the center instead of it being white, just solid white. If I need to throw some in, I can do that. So here it is, just adding my little pokies, little lines, and then adding my little dots all the way around. I know my hand's in the way, but I'm just creating a bunch of little bitty dots. That's why my hand's straight up and down. Adding a little bit of black in the center of that. Just throwing a little bit in. I'm going to create another one here, just doing little straight lines coming out of the center. That one didn't have much of a black in the center, but that's fine. Here's one a little bit more closer so you can see, just adding little straight lines here and there and then little dots in the center and then coming around the outside and around the top with little dots. Creates that little dandelion look. Little dots in there, and there you have it. So that's all I'm going to be doing. Now I'm not going to do these on every single one. There is going to be some of them like little dots that I could add a dandelion in toward the top or maybe even toward the bottom that I could have, but I just didn't. And that's just because I wanted them random. So here, putting another one in here. These dandelions are so cute. I absolutely love doing those. So now we're going to start on the pelican's neck. And I'm going to basically be using like 3 different colors. So all of these are going to be in gouache. So now we're just using the gouache, but I'm using a white, I'm using a blue, and I'm using the black. Now with those 3 colors, I'm able to make like a bluish gray or a light blue gray tones. I'm able to darken, making more of a darker or medium tone gray blue, and then even go even darker by making it maybe a darker gray. So I can really work with just those 3 colors in this bird. And so that's all I'm doing. I'm just mixing up my blues with my whites and my blacks to make like a light blue gray to a medium tone. So that way I can kind of transition between light and dark. Now, I know with watercolor or with gouache, a lot of people like to work a little bit more looser than I do. I am just very used to working with more of like acrylic paint, and I like the layering process. So I do my watercolors a little bit differently. I wouldn't say I'm like expert at watercolors and gouache or anything like that, because I never really worked with gouache until recently. I started using gouache, and I did a few things with watercolor, but I really like mixed media. So I'm very big into mixed media. I'm very big into layering. So this is just something that I do, and it may, you get a watercolor person in here, they might be like, hey, you're doing this wrong, but I like the way it looks, and that's what makes me happy. So that's what I'm teaching here. So basically, I'm just doing a layering process, just basically putting in some of my midtones, and now I'm working with the white gouache to go over it, and I'm going to have to go over it a few times anyway. And I'm just making little marks in there with his little fur and feathers going in the direction that I see in the reference photo. So making these little stripes, little bitty dots, making these little bitty hairs, and I'm curving them around, adding them to go in the swooping direction that it shows in the reference photo. Now, as you can see, I'm throwing in some darks in there, and that's just to add a little bit more depth to it in some areas, just by adding in some more darks. Now, as this dries, I will, toward the end, go back over it and add more white to it, just so that way it pops a little bit more. So here I am adding in some darker grays. It's not black, it's got some white mixed in there, but it is with my black. And so I made some darker grays, and then toward the top where it's more lighter, I am putting in more of a bluish gray. So here I am just kind of tossing in some of that blue grays and mixing them in, so that way it transitions really nicely between the light and dark. And then once that's all in, here's some of the green too that had in the center. So I'm coming back in and adding some more of my green. Now here I am going over it, the little spikes that kind of come out, like little feather spikes it has, and just adding that white in. And then I'll be coming through, adding some textures, going in the same direction that I see in the reference photo by adding in some of my white. Now the white has been really watered down quite a bit, so it's going to end up drying and be more translucent to the colors underneath. So it ain't going to be super bright white once it dries. So in that case, that's fine, because then I'm going to have to add another layer to it once it dries, and it'll be more of a white. Throwing in some of the darks back in, just to give it a little bit more depth. There, I'm adding a little bit more white and going in the same direction that I see in the reference photo on where those little hairs and feathers go. So here I am going to take a little bit more of a bluish tone, and I'm going to throw that in. Just in some places, just throwing in some blue. I definitely like these cooler tones in here, just kind of tossing them in randomly, because it really helps to kind of break this up and add more color and more tone to this bird. So throwing in those blues definitely help. And I really did like the color too. Adding some blue in there. And I came back through and I accidentally added a lot of blue in this area. I thought about it and thought, okay, I can either adjust that or just leave it. And I decided to leave it because I was perfectly fine with it, since I'm going to have to layer again and throw in some more whites on top. So it's perfectly fine. Now, usually with watercolor, people like to go from light to dark. And here's the eye too. I'm doing a little bit of blue in there, and I'm going to let that dry before I come back in and put the center and start working on this eye. So make sure that that blue is dry around there. But usually people like to work from light to dark when working with watercolor because it's a lot easier for you to leave your whites, like your brightest whites, white by using your canvas or maybe your paper to kind of show through. And in this case, since I was working with gouache, it's a little bit more opaque. And as long as you can layer with it, I mean, that was really nice. But I did not do that technique on this. I just used my gouache, kind of the same as a kind of like using watercolor or not watercolor, but acrylic paints in a way, which, you know, adding highlights or adding more of that tone to it, then I would do that. Now, if I wanted it super, super bright white, then yeah, I would probably leave that area blank with the canvas and then go on top of it with your gouache white or tone it down a little bit. But I didn't do that in this case. Here I'm creating the beak and I'm using yellow and red and just kind of mixing those up in between just to kind of give me a orange or a orangey yellow and just kind of change the shades on it depending on how much of the red I add to it. For some really kind of washed out yellow, I did do a little bit of white and yellow to kind of create more of a lighter, more pastel-y kind of yellow. Now you can always tone this down. So once it dries, if it comes out too pastel-y yellow or too brighty yellow, don't worry about it. You can always go on top of it with some gray and it'll tone it down some. Or as long as you have enough water mixed in with that gray, should I say, make it like a glaze and kind of glaze over it with the gray, then it'll tone it down. If you go over the top of it with some of the gouache and you don't have a lot of water in it, then it could end up taking it out completely. So be careful with that one. So here I'm adding his mouth. I'm using some really dark gray in here. It's not black, it's really dark gray. And I'm just making my textures, my little marks, his little wrinkles or little lines that are in his beak. Putting in some shadow too, using the same color, like a darker gray. And then kind of continuing that line all the way up and down on his bill. Now I'm going to end up taking a little bit more of a yellowish kind of color and adding that to his beak bill there, just to kind of add a little bit more of a lighter tone. Now this here is dark gray that I'm putting in on his bill. Now you can always go lighter. Like I said, you can make it a lot lighter than what I'm making it on here. I kind of did a reversal and went dark gray and then left some areas open that I really wanted lighter and then went on top of it just from adding some more of my lighter tones in there. So as you can tell, I'm putting in some of my lighter grays and mid-tone grays and just kind of blotching them in there. So that way it's kind of speckled. It's not all one solid color. I really like those speckles and those little marks to just kind of transition in color. Cleaning up some of those edges there. Coming back through and adding a little bit of a yellowish tone going up and down his bill. Now I'm taking some gray and it's really kind of washed out. So that way I can go on top of this yellow and tone that yellow down because it was a little bit too yellow. So by taking my gray with a lot of water in it and just kind of washing it over the top of that yellow, I'm able to tone that yellow down. So once I'm done with that, I'm going to come back in with some more of my lighter grays and just kind of add some textures and spotting throughout some of this darker area of his bill. So coming back through, and as you can tell, the nostril that I did have in pitch black there is pretty much gone. I kind of went over on top of it, so I'm going to have to put his nostril back in, which is no problem. But here I'm just adding some speckles and some lighter tones into his bill. Adding some darker, like a black, and going in and darkening up some of these areas in here. Definitely helps adding that touch of darkness there. Man, I don't want to add it everywhere, but just in places that are super, super dark. Now here I'm going up to his eye. I'm adding in some grays in here just to kind of tone some of these areas, adding a little bit of shadow in and around his eyes and the little wrinkles. Now, I know this is a little bit blurry. I don't know why my camera did not want to focus that good, but we will have to make do with it. Just adding in some tones in there, adding in a little bit of a brighter yellow in some of these areas, but I will go back on top of it with some of my grays, just so that way I'm kind of toning some of these areas down just a little bit. So it's all going to be up to you on how you want to tone your eye. Now I am working with gouache and watercolor here, so with this, well, the gouache is the main on this, but just adding some speckles and just kind of making it a little bit more looser. I'm not too worried about too much detail, but just to have fun with it. Here I'm going to throw in a little bit more of my darker shades, like my darker grays back in. I'm going to throw some in there, make some speckles. That way there's more texture and more feel to his beak. Here I'm adding in the black for the nostril and putting it back in. And then I'm going to add a little bit of a highlight over the top. And since that looked a little bit too bright, I'm going to go in with more of a gray tone, and that is his little nostril. So now for the final touch, I'm going to go through and add some more white to his feathers. That way they stand out. This is not as washed out with water as the other was, so it adds a little bit more of an opaque white. And I'm going to go in and just kind of make these little streaks and little dots and just go in the direction that I see in the reference photo. So just putting those whites back in so that way they kind of stand out a little bit more. Putting the little ones in there. And then making more of these longer little hairs and furs, kind of going in the direction that I see, which definitely helps out. So now we're going to start on the bigger feathers. I am using a really big round brush here. I think it's like a size 12. And with this, I can easily go in and just use or basically take advantage of that brush. That brush has a really nice round with a point at the end of it. So I'm able to kind of use that brush using the tip and then squishing it down to make like a feather shape. And I'm just going to go in and make these shapes of the feathers all the way through, looking at the direction that I see in the reference photo, and I'm just going to go in the same direction. Now I'm changing out between a lighter gray and a bluish gray. So those are the tones that I'm using. I will end up layering quite a bit, so I'm going to go back on top of this with more of a white. But for right now, I'm just kind of creating the feathers. And there we go, just kind of squishing that brush down to create a feather kind of look. I'm leaving some spaces in between so that way I can go in with a darker color. Just making sure you go in the direction that you see in the reference photo and where those feathers go, or if they need to go a little bigger, the further they come out. Adding some little bit of blue tone to some of these feathers here till I get those in there. Now here I'm going to go in, and I kind of get excited sometimes when I'll just start drawing random lines through them. I'm not really necessarily to that part where I'm actually going to be doing that, but I will be doing that. But I just had some fun and just started throwing them in there randomly. Here I'm going to go in and just start adding some of my darker grays in between the feathers. Now I'm trying to go in and around some of the feathers just randomly, trying to fill in some of these white areas that are just there, putting some greens back in maybe just to kind of fill in some of those outside areas with some green. And I'm just basically doing a filler is all I am doing. It's just kind of filling in and around those feathers with some darker tones, like a darker gray or a dark, a darker blue. Mostly like a gray blue. Now I can still see, I don't know if it shows up too much on camera, but I can still see where my feathers are going. Like I see the direction of where my feathers are. I see the marks on where I had put those feathers in. But I'm just going through and I'm just going to randomly do that. Here I'm just showing that I'm going to go over the top of each of these feathers and just kind of add some white in there. I may have went ahead and did this just so that way I wanted to have some fun with it before I kept going. I do things out of order. Definitely always do. But here I'm going to continue on adding more of my darker tones in between as a filler. Once I get those in there, then I can easily go on top of it with some water and blend some of that out. So there I'm kind of adding in some more of my darker tones in there, in between some of these areas. And don't worry if you make a harsh line, like it's really kind of harsh once you put those darker tones in there, you can always go back in with a wet brush and just kind of soften it out a little bit. So there I am, just filling in some of those areas, because you don't want it just completely white. Now here I started to go with some of the darker tones in between, but then I got a wet brush and I just started going over that and just kind of softening it out. I had some lines drawn in. I'll have to come back through with some white to make the texture or the same way the feathers go on this part. But here I'm just using a wet brush just to kind of fill in some of those white areas. And now I'm going to take that wet brush and kind of soften out some of these darker areas too in between the wings. Just any place that I think that it looks a little bit too harsh of lines, like dark lines. Now here's the part where I'm going to come in with my white gouache and I'm going to go over the top of all the feathers that I have in there, just creating some layering is what I'm doing, just adding in that white. Don't worry if it doesn't come out too white. That's fine. Just let it dry. If you need to go over it again, you can. If not, and you like the way it looks, then you can just leave it. So that's totally up to you. But I'm just putting back in my white over the top of the feathers that I had down. Putting some bigger strokes in there and some bigger feathers. And then once I'm done with that, and I like the way the feathers look, then I can come back in and let it dry, and I can come back in with some of my black or a dark gray and add some lines for in between the little feathers. Here I'm going to come in with the white and start adding my texture of my feathers that kind of come out. Now I'm just doing like kind of like little swooping lines, kind of like a little wicker basket kind of look, kind of just whisking out. And that's just how it looked on the reference photo, so just kind of putting those feathers in there randomly. Coming back through and just kind of adding a little touches here and there, maybe toward the ends of some of these little feathers. I really like layering, so this definitely helps whenever you can layer. And as you layer, you notice that now the white's staining out a little bit more as I go. And that's just because some of those areas have dried, and then I can add in the white. And here's the last bit where I am taking my black or my dark gray and making the little lines through the center of the feathers. So I'm going to add in these lines like here and there. I won't be adding them on every single feather, but just a few of them. And yeah, that pretty much sums it up. And here is the final piece. As you can see, there's these nice little white speckles everywhere. Those are easy to create. Just take your gouache on your brush and tap it over your painting to give it this sparkle type of look. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. If you like this video, please leave a like. Definitely helps the channel. And if you want to join Patreon, the link is listed below in the description. And I'll see you all on the next video. Bye, you guys.